this was at the same time that I was really trying to learn my camera that was now about 6 months in my hand, the Nikon Z9. And so I started learning a lot about the camera. And in the process of watching different videos, I started learning about focus stacking and the capability within the camera. And because it's used so heavily for macro, I spent some time really learning macro. So what this is a culmination of trying to just share a little bit of that introductory knowledge with all of you on focus stacking for macro purposes. It can be used for any purpose though. And when several of us were on recent workshops, we kind of practiced this for landscapes, etc. So I wanted to just kind of introduce this to you. David is recording it, and we will also post this presentation. So you don't have to copiously take lots of notes, just kind of take the notes that you want to go back and look at. So when I look at this, what we're going to do is we're going to explore it mostly for macro, but we're going to talk about a little bit about taking the images and editing the image. And you guys, I've built in a few places to stop and see if you have any questions, but ask anytime. So for Macro March, just a couple of reminders. It doesn't require focus stacking. This is just a new learning opportunity. But it's something to think about if you want to not only practice macro, you can also practice focus stacking as a piece of it. And macro images don't require macro lenses. Don't assume you have to have one to achieve the macro image. Almost any kind of lens can achieve some level of macro. It's just that the macros are really designed for that. But I've had good success with macro images with non-macro dedicated lenses. So experiment with the various lenses that you have. Don't feel like you have to invest in anything. What I'm going to do today is just kind of go over the overview of what is focus stacking, and then we'll talk a little bit about taking the image, then we'll talk a little bit about taking it into Lightroom and into Photoshop. And at the end, we'll just remind you of a few things that are coming up. So for anyone listening to this later, you'll have the benefit of all this information. So first of all, focus stacking is really, really designed as a technique to improve sharpness throughout the full depth of field. For those of you who have used macro lenses or the lens babies, I know you've practiced with it quite a bit, Mahana, and some of that. What you do is you get part of your image in focus and another part of it's fuzzy. Sometimes that's exactly what you want. But if it's an image that you want sharp throughout the entire depth of field for that image, focus stacking is a great way to achieve that. So first of all, it is kind of used to achieve a full depth of field. And what you end is you end up taking lots of images or several images and then blending or stacking them together. And through this process, and I'll show it to you in just a moment on some images, you focus on different spots within the image field so that you can blend it and create that sharpness that you want throughout the entire image. It could be as simple as 3 images. Again, I'll show you an example in a minute. And then it can be more complex, combining hundreds of images to achieve sharpness. And that's really designed for those who are really looking at serious macro photography. A lot of cameras now offer it. A lot of the newer cameras offer a feature inside the camera that is called focus shifting or focus stacking that can do a lot of this process for you. And again, I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So you think about it, and it is about sharpness and consistency and really trying to remove a lot of the softness that you would get in images that if you only shot it one time, you would lose some of the sharpness around the edges. So in order to achieve this, you probably have everything you need right now. And that is basically you need a tripod, period. Your camera, the lens that you choose, or several lenses to test it. But you have to have that tripod because you need that consistency. Just like when you're doing bracketing or when you're doing long exposures, it provides you with that stability and the consistency of taking the image from one spot at one time. You also can need a light source. Landscape, it's most often your natural light source. When you're inside and you're trying to shoot a flower or some other image, You could be doing it with additional lighting. It could be your home lighting, fixed lighting, strobe lighting. There's lots of ways to achieve it. The image that you see on this slide is really designed to show that, from natural lighting to a more sophisticated setup to where you're looking at something that's being held, you've got lights all around, or just as simple as put your image near a window, glass plate, something like that, to get some more lighting around it the way that you desire it. It's also good if you do have a remote trigger, so you're not shaking the camera. That's very much like long exposures. Maybe you have a light box or a product setup, or you create it to where you put some foam board around or under or something like that if it's a small item or subject that you're shooting. Sometimes color gels, water spray, those kinds of things can help. You saw a lot of good opportunities in when Barry and David announced the 4 winners today. All of those had some level of how to use lighting and color and stuff like that to bring out these images. And then sometimes you just need the support, and it can be as simple as you've got a flower with a long stem and you tape it to a stick or put it in a straw or something like that, but you want that image to be held securely. If you go outside and you try to take the tulips right now and the wind's blowing like it did today, you're going to have a lot of difficulty getting a sharpness, especially in focus stacking, because there's going to be too much movement. Hope that makes sense for you. So let me talk for a few minutes about shooting the stacked images from simple to complex, and that'll help you determine what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it. So in the landscape example, it's real simple. And you can do this if you've got a touch screen for your camera on the back of your camera, a live view. It's real simple to just touch the screen in the right areas. If you don't have a touch screen, just move your joystick through this process. But basically, once you choose your subject and you've got it on a tripod and you've got your settings the way you want it, then you want to focus in multiple areas. In this case, in every case, by the way, you always start with the spot closest to you. So if you were looking through your viewfinder right here, you see this foreground concept and you want to focus there and take your image. Using the same settings and everything, then you focus on the middle ground and you take another image. And then finally, you take the background image. Again, just focusing on that spot. And then in a minute, we'll show you how you just blend these images, edit them lightly in Lightroom, and then go over to Photoshop and blend that. So that's a real simple aspect of, this is how you can get that depth of field and complete depth of field in your landscape photography by doing focus stacking. It's different from the bracketing, because with the bracketing, you're changing your settings to bring out elements of the sky. You're bringing out different lighting situations. You're most often changing your shutter speed to bracket, but this is similar to that in that you're taking multiple images and you plan to blend it. Then you'll end with your full image. The reason that I recommend that you take that 4th shot with that center weight matrix is because then you have one image where it's as sharp as it can be if you were just taking it on its own. And that way it can always be there to help blend or to see how it was in real life at that time. Any quick questions before I move on? Okay. And David, feel free to join in anytime. All right.
I'm taking a few notes. I'll circle back after
okay.
You're done. Just touch on, maybe reiterate a couple of points that are pretty critical.
Well, you might want to do it as we go, just so that we don't go breezing past it too far. Go ahead. Sorry, did I catch you? You're trying to eat. Sorry.
I was trying to turn off I was pushing the space bar earlier to talk. All right, and just a couple of things. First off, and you talked about this already with the settings, you're going to want to be on manual. You don't want the camera automatically adjusting anything during this, other than if you're using the auto stack feature in your camera. And I don't mean that it's blending it in camera. What I mean by that, and Delana touched on it already, is that some of today's cameras have built in this ability to say, start here and just gradually focus further and further out, and it'll take all the images until it says that the infinity is done. You just don't want anything in the camera changing during that. You don't want your white balance, for example. Don't set it on auto, because if during that change, the white balance, it picks up on a particular layer there that's a little darker or lighter or bluer or yellower or whatever. If it's on auto, it's going to be adjusting. And so then when you go to blend, you'll get a kind of a weird halo type effect potentially in the images. So you want to make sure you're on full manual when you're doing this. If you're focus stacking, you need to be on full manual, including your white balance needs to be set at 5,500 or just set it on daylight or whatever. Just don't have it on auto. The metering she talked about a little bit. Really, you want to kind of meter the overall scene. You're not necessarily having to bracket during focus stacking, but there are times when you may want to, particularly if you're doing a very wide angle shot like this, and you're trying to get a foreground in focus, but you also need the background in focus. You may have to do some bracketing, in particular when you get to the background, because usually it's typically going to be a bright sky or something like that, or it might be a dark sky and you're going to need to expose for a longer period of time. And then on the f-stop setting, she said here, based on a single image, f5, 6 to f8. I would say you want to stick to the f8 area to f11, only because that's kind of your sweet spot, and it's where the lenses typically are most, they have the most depth in focus in terms of complete clarity. If you get above f11, you can get some diffraction. Now, it's minuscule, and I am, if I have been known to focus stack at f20 or f18 just to get more depth of field. And if you're going to shoot at f8 or f11 in this kind of scene, you might want 5 images. If you're shooting at f16, f18, you could probably get by with 3. The other factor is, how close is your foreground? I was at a DPPA, Dallas Professional Photographer Association meeting last night, and the guy uses his 14 millimeter, and his first subject, which was a flower, is only about 6 inches away from his camera, and he'll take 6 shots in the first 6 to 8 inches and then back out and start taking further away. But the closer you are to the camera, the more images you need to take. If your very first closest subject is 3 feet away, you might be fine with 3 shots or 4 shots. But if you've got something within about 6 inches of your lens, in other words, as close as you can possibly focus, that depth of field, even at f16 or whatever, is probably only 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in that first 3 inches. And so you're going to really need to stack those images more. The good news is that with and she's going to go into how you edit them, there's really no difference between, other than the amount of time it takes, between having 8 images and having 3 images or having 28 images. It really only gets to be a big, huge issue when you're truly using a macro lens and you've seen these images of like an insect or something, and some of those may contain 500 or 600 images that are being blended together. But for us, most of what we're doing, this is going to be fine. And what she just says right here on the screen, 1, 2, 3, is probably great, unless those rocks happen to be real close. And then you might need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, something like that. Okay, there you go. I've caught up. All my notes are caught up now.
Excellent. Very good. Yeah, I would rather have the conversation at that
Okay.
moment, just so that we can,
Okay.
fully understand the concept before we move on. So it's good.
Okay.
Any questions? Good.
Are you done with talking about taking the image?
No, ma'am.
Not
Okay.
yet.
Okay,
yet.
I just wanted to, that little hint you gave me about putting your hand in front of the camera.
Oh yeah, that is the thing that I do for bracketing. A lot of people do for bracketing. I also do it for the focus stacking. And honestly, just because it's me, I'm crazy. I will actually do different hand signals for one and the other. For bracketing, I just put it in front of my camera, and for focus stacking, I usually do like it looks like I'm pointing one direction or the other, and it just helps me so that when I go into Lightroom, I tell the difference between this is a set of bracketed. But I also look at if I've changed my shutter speed, then I know it's bracketed, and if all of the settings are consistent, I know it's focus stacked. So that's just one of the things. Is that what you were talking about, Melody?
Uh-huh.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yes.
So now if we're starting to get into macros, you're going to need a lot more images to really get the fully blended, full depth of field for an image. And I'm showing you here with the yellow dots an example. And in this example, it's a case of if you're doing it manually, how you might walk through it, but it also starts indicating how the cameras start picking up the different depths of field. And again, it all starts with the focus point closest to you. That's kind of where you see the number 1. So the point's closest to you, but then what the camera will do and what you can do manually is you start covering the area almost like you're walking or creeping along to get the key pivotal focus points throughout that entire image. So when you see these dots, then basically you're looking at, coming up at like over here and then over here to the right part. And then you're going to kind of go toward just the next one. So it's getting foreground, middle ground, background, but there's more steps in this foreground, middle ground, background. If you've got a camera that'll do it for you, they're going to take as many shots as you indicate or until it's covered the full depth of field. And I'll stop and show you that in a minute when we get to the next slide. But again, going back to what David said, you're fully manual, you're setting your focus point, whether that's by touch or by joystick, to each of these areas, but you start closest to you, and it's almost like you're walking through the image to get those pivotal points throughout the image. Stick again with the same f-stop so that you're consistent there. Stick with the same image that you have, the metering that you have. I did not know about the white balance on auto, so that was a really, really good aha for me, David, and I'm glad to hear that. And then again, whether you start with the full image, fully focused as if you were going to take just one, or you end with that, make sure you get an image that's just, if you were going to take one image, the best settings that you have according to your knowledge as well as the camera's expertise, then be sure and do that before or after so that you've got that one image that's not focused just on one area. So David, what else would you add to that and before I go over to the camera aspect? You're still on mute. There you are.
Sometimes the space bar works and sometimes it doesn't. I don't know why. How many of you know what focus breathing means? Basically what it is, and on an image like this one right here, you probably wouldn't notice it much. But on an image where there's more depth between the closest element and the element furthest away, even if you leave, assume you have a zoom lens, 14 to 24, or you're using a 70 to 200, doesn't matter. And you never change your focal length. You could be with a prime lens, a 50 millimeter macro lens. And as you focus at different points, further closer to you and further away, it looks like the camera is zooming in or zooming out. And it's called focus breathing. And it's the composition, what's contained in the frame changes as your focus point changes. And so just be aware of that so that whenever you start going through this and start stacking images, you're going to, if you fast forward through them, it's going to look like your focal length is changing. It's going to look like you're zooming in or zooming out on something, and not a lot, but enough that it's noticeable. Newer lenses are getting better at avoiding that, but I just want you to be aware of it, because whenever we start talking about the editing, that'll be something that the reason why you're not going to be quite as capable manually stacking these images and editing them is because of that focus breathing. So that's the only thing I would really bring up. And you probably, on an image like what we have here on the screen, you might not really notice it that much. There might be a little bit, but if you had a deeper element that you were trying to photograph, it'll show up.
That's great. Thank you. All right, so let me talk just a little bit about if your camera has this built-in focus shifting. And do any of you know if your camera has this? Did you take a look? Have you used it before? You don't know? Okay.
If you send me or Delana your camera model, and we can do a quick check and let you know whether it's something that you can use. In some cameras, it's buried deep in the menu section because not many people use it, but it's helpful to know if you have it. And like on my camera, I made it a shortcut to it. I created a shortcut so that I could get to it quickly and easily. I put it in my menu options so I can quickly get to it, because otherwise trying to go find it can take a little time. So I just created a shortcut, and this is what I see. Obviously, Delana and I have the same camera. It's a pretty powerful tool if you find yourself in a position where you want to do this, multiple times. And, for this year's or this month's topic, it's a great thing to go in, play around with it, learn it, and then you have it, and you can use it the next time you have something come up that you want to try to do creatively with it. Go ahead, Delana.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because that was one of, like I said, I started looking at trying to learn more about my camera and learned about this a little bit. And so, for the Nikon, it's the photo shooting menu. And for your Canons, because I know Melody and Mahana are both Canons. Celia, I think you're Sony, and Kelly just said she was a Nikon. Oh, you're a Canon too. Okay, so it may be called something different. It could be focus stacking, shifting, but most of the time it's called something like focus shift shooting. And most of the time it'll be in your photo shooting menu, or possibly in your timers and exposures. Sometimes it might be in there. But let's just assume for a moment that you find something on it. Let me tell you the process of what it's doing. If you look at the focus shift shooting menu here. So what it's going to do, and like David, I put mine in my I menu that has just some real quick shortcuts, so I can find it pretty quickly if I want it. It allows you to set the number of maximum shots that you would want. Now this shows 100. I would not advocate starting with 100. Let me tell you, I would advocate maybe starting with 20. Because here's the deal: if your camera reads this and it goes through that entire field, like on the previous slide, and it only needs 14 to cover it, it will take 14 shots. If it only needs 8, it will take 8 shots. So put a lower number to get started with. I'm going to show you in a minute an image I did, and it actually had 51 images in it. And it took a few minutes to take it, and it takes a few minutes to process it, but it was what that camera saw that it needed. When I was in Vermont last October, You know, I had it set maybe on 25. It only needed 12 for a scene outside, and that's all it took. The next thing you see on there is focus step width. In our camera, it's from 1 to 10. And what this means is, and I'm going to go back for just a second. If you see this camera, it means that it's going to take one step. If it's low, it's going to take a whole lot more steps. It's going to go, you're going to see a whole lot more yellow dots on there, a lot more focus points that are used if the increment is 1. If it's 10, it's going to take fewer steps, fewer focus points, because there's going to be more steps or intervals between those focus points that it chooses. A good rule of thumb from most of the videos that I watch is just set it in the middle, test it out, see how that works for you around a 5, or you can start with a 10, you know, the maximum. If you go to the 1, it's going to automatically take it because it's going to be taking it very short increments. Now, once you've practiced and you've gotten used to this and tested it with your subject, you can then go in and adjust it. You can go see that it needs a tighter step width, or that it needs a few more shots than what you set it for. But just kind of start with the average so that you don't sit there for a long period of time and get frustrated because you don't know what it's doing. Start with the middle or the medium just to get started. The next aspect of this is the interval and text until next shot. Most cases, if it's clicking and you have just an average shutter speed, etc., then you don't need any seconds between it or any fractions of seconds. But if you're doing something that is kind of low light, you've got a longer exposure to it, and it's kind of like with night photography or something, when you're doing time lapse, if you have a 5-second shot, you're going to need 5 seconds till the next shot, or you're going to need some interval to the next shot just because it has to have time to close down and open back up. And David will help me a little bit with that. And then it's got, you know, do you want me to smooth the exposure off and on? I've seen it both ways. The silent photography is just a feature where you can have it on or off. Your camera may not work well if silent photography is on. That's another thing you'll have to check into. And then the other aspect of it is that that starting storage folder. I actually have clicked on that, and what happens in this case is once you start a focus shift session on it, and I say start it, and it takes those shots, it actually puts it into a different folder on my card. It could be practical. It has been practical in some cases, but it's something, again, that you'll want as a personal preference. But watch some YouTube videos, read your manual, see if your camera has that. Will help you a little bit with it, and you'll be able to tell this. But just start slow, start simple with it, so you learn what the camera can do, and then start really playing with it. Because I learned so much just by playing with it and seeing how it works differently than normal focused shift or normal bracketing or normal just, you know, trying to do this on your own. David, go ahead.
Yeah, Kelly, the Nikon D5300 will not have this built into it. So just FYI, but you don't need this. It's handy. It's helpful. I'm glad I have it in the camera body that I have, or bodies, but it's not necessary. To give you an example, so at the club meeting last night, our guest speaker, his name, and you can look him up, is Ryan, R-Y-A-N, last name Dyer, D-Y-A-R, Ryan Dyer. And his primary focus on his talk last night was on creating three-dimensionality within your images and how he does it. But we spent some time talking about focus stacking because he does a lot of those wide images with the flowers in the foreground, the mountains in the background. You know, you'll see in his work. But we talked about focus stacking, and somebody says, "So, how do you calculate how many shots you're going to take, and how you go?" He says, "I don't know." He says, "I take my lens, I go all the way to one side, I take a picture, I rotate it about a centimeter, I take a picture, I rotate it a centimeter, I take a picture, I rotate it. So all of this technical, all of this stuff is handy and nice to have, but is it necessary? Not at all. I've used it effectively. And again, I'm glad I have it, but I didn't have it all the way up until last January, and I was able to do focus stacking. So just because your camera doesn't have this doesn't mean that you can't be very effective at focus stacking. It's just a matter of, again, figuring out how many shots do I need to take to get a good exposure, and remembering that the further away from your lens you get, the fewer shots you need. If you just focus really, really heavily on, wow, I've got stuff real close to my lens, take a whole bunch of shots, not too far apart. And then the further you get from your lens, the further apart your shots can get, and you'll still be okay. To your point about, the number of seconds till the next shot and really exposure smoothing, I think that has more to do with if you're taking pictures of something that's static, but you need really long exposures in order to get enough light. You're not bringing in artificial light. You may need really long exposures in order to get there. But if the light's changing, you're going to have that ability to change those exposure lengths. And that's where the exposure smoothing comes in. The silent photography would only apply to mirrorless cameras, and not all mirrorless cameras are silent. They have a mechanical shutter. So it really is focused on those cameras that are mirrorless and have an electronic shutter, not a mechanical one. And in that case, you would see the silent photography option. But most of the time, you're probably not going to see that in a focus stack. Okay, moving on.
Yeah, and I've done it both ways too. Sometimes I want the camera to do a little bit for me just to see what it looks like, and sometimes the very next series of shots I'll do it myself just to see if I can get close to it. So it's
Right.
a nice thing to have because it teaches you, but it's not required in any way. I think we just walked through a little bit of how you can adjust it.
Mm-hmm.
And welcome, Rhonda, and congratulations on your honorable mention. Ooh.
It was a great picture.
I just happened to open my phone and I was shocked. So thank you.
She did. She spent a lot of time learning how to get all that done. So that's pretty cool.
And that's
all right,
perfect.
So
we love that. We love people learning how to do new things. Okay, go ahead.
Like focus stacking. So any questions about taking the image before we move on to the editing the image?
How many people are like lost?
Yeah.
Celia's kind of like,
Are you recording this so that
yes.
Thank you.
All right. So you can go back and rewatch it.
Okay.
But the key is really understanding depth of field. And I think most of you understand that. If you shoot very close to your camera, even with shooting at like f/18 or f/20, which is supposed to give you great depth of field, if you're really close to your camera lens, that doesn't matter. I went out earlier halfway prepping for this and took my 70-200, went to 200 millimeters, got close to the red bud that's outside, and I'm trying to shoot. I'm at f/20, and I'm really close to my lens, as close as I can be and still focus. And the tip of the leaf is in focus, but the back of the leaf is not. And that's just the function of the closer you are to your lens, the shallower your depth of field, regardless of what f-stop you're shooting at. It's one of the reasons why if you get a macro lens, it'll go all the way up to f/50, something like that. I mean, crazy tiny little hole to shoot through, trying to get depth of field because it will focus literally that far away from the subject. And so that's the key part of focus stacking and the whole point of it. If everything we shot was 7 feet or further from the lens, you'd never have to worry about focus stacking. Maybe you need 2 shots. But because we want to give that feeling that a person is standing right there, they're kneeling, they're laying on the ground with those beautiful flowers right in front of them. But in the distance is this magnificent snow-covered mountain with the beautiful sunrise or something going on. There's just simply no way to get all of that in focus without taking a whole bunch of pictures and laying them on top of each other. And as we're about to get into, using technology, software, to pick out the sharpest parts of the image and bring those in so that now you have that clarity from front to back that you kind of experience because your eye is so quick at focusing between near ground and background. But I challenge you, even within your room, to take a look at something 2 feet from you and honestly think to yourself, well, was that picture on the wall over there actually in focus? It's not. So it's just like your camera, but you have the ability to shift your eye and it's immediately in focus. You don't have to back button focus. You don't have to push the shutter button. You don't have to do anything. Your eye just focuses automatically. So imagine looking at something close to you and then looking at that wall. And what you're doing is you're taking very thin slices of your eye, tracking all the way through there and making sure each one is in focus, blending them together so that you get everything in focus. Maybe I've
But you can
confused
take a-
Celia even more.
Yeah. You can take a great macro shot and you intentionally want bokeh behind it. And this is
Mhm.
not what you're looking for. It's
Mhm.
it's kind of different. But even at the image that's on the screen right now, you've got the kind of bokeh off to the left side, but you've got these beautiful drops in these veins in the leaf and stuff like that. Some of that's in focus. Not every single depth of it is in focus. With focus stacking, you could have more of it in focus and blended if you go through the process. It's just another technique. And since this is Macro March, we wanted to give you a shot at testing it out. So let me go ahead and talk a little bit about editing the stacked images. So this image right here of a succulent is one that I actually practiced with. I practiced on rocks. I practiced with leaves. I practiced with flowers. I practiced with glass ornaments. This succulent is the one that I ended up really focused on and took the focus stacking process with my camera through, and then submitted it for the photo club that Mahana and Melody and I are members of. So I wanted to take you through the process of what happened here. So the first thing I did was I did use my tripod and my Z9. In this case, I used a 24-120 f4 lens with natural light. With using my in-camera feature, it took 51 images. You can see them on the screen right now, 51 images. And as you look at them, they all look exactly the same. But what the camera did was it really shifted the focus slightly on all of these throughout these 51 images. I shot it at 120, f5.6, ISO 64, and 1/30th of a second. So it just was very consistent in there. So the first thing you do is you just open up all your images in Lightroom Classic like you normally would. You take your first image, you edit it the way you want to in terms of the nice light, the exposure, anything you want to do in terms of brushes or gradients, in terms of color, texture, all of your natural editing that you would do on a single image, you go ahead, bring it into Lightroom and do that. Then, of course, you highlight all of them and you sync the settings so that now you have 51 images that have the same settings. Then the next thing you do is that you go in there with them all highlighted and you say edit in, and you normally go to Photoshop 2023, but now you do open as layers in Photoshop. So these 51 images are going to all open on the same file, but as 51 layers in Photoshop. And that's how you take them into Lightroom, edit the images, sync the settings, open as layers in Photoshop. Then the next thing you do is if you look over on the right side, you now have 51 layers. All 51 layers are there. All 51 images are there and they're set as layers. You make sure that you highlight all of those layers while in Photoshop. And then you go over to the edit menu and you choose auto align layers. Now you may be asking, okay, I used a tripod. Why do I need to do this? Because slight movement will occur without you even ever knowing it. The camera's not, you're not moving the camera, you're not touching the camera through an automated process. Or if you are doing your own setting your focus points, you may be, clicking the camera just by setting your focus points, even if you have a remote trigger. So there's going to be some slight movement. So when you do this auto align edit process, then what happens is it makes sure that everything just lines up perfectly, and you'll almost always see just a little white line somewhere around an edge or two that shows that there was slight variation. So if you go into auto align layers, then in this case, a menu pops up and you pick auto projection so that it aligns it from all corners. And then while it's happening, it will show you the progress. And in this case, it says that it's a line layer, and in parentheses it says 34. Well, that's at that moment, it was on from 51, 50, 49, 48. It had gone to image number 34, and it goes in a backwards order from the layers. That's how the layers are brought in. You don't need to really know all that, except make sure all your layers are highlighted, auto align layers, check auto projection, and then let it do its work. I did this again yesterday just to kind of time it. And this part of the process, it took under 8 minutes on my desktop, which has my fastest processor, to bring them into Photoshop. It took about 7 or 8 minutes to do the auto align. I'm going to stop. Any questions on just this process so far? Okay. And David, would you add anything? Yep.
Yeah. The reason you need to do the auto align, even if you're on a tripod and absolutely nothing's moved, you've not even touched the camera, it's just been taking pictures, is because of the focus breathing I was talking about earlier. The camera is doing its best to make sure that that affects the smallest part of the image as possible. So that would be the one thing I would say, the reason why you need to do that. I mean, there's several other reasons, possibly the subject's moved, or the tripod got bumped, or maybe you're outside, there's the tiniest little bit of breeze. Anything could be a reason for that. But primarily, assuming you're in a controlled environment with a tripod, you would go, why do I need to align the layers? Focus breathing, if you're doing focus stacking, will be the issue. Just as a follow-up to something we said earlier, you gave us your camera types. Melody, you say an EOS R. I don't know if there's supposed to be a number after that, but the EOS R5 and the 90D both have focus shift or stacking built in as a menu item, but it's called, for Canon, they call it focus bracketing. So if you want to go to YouTube, put in your camera model focus bracketing, you'll probably find videos specific to your camera on how to find the menu item and how to use it. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, mine's an older camera, or it's the first EOS R. So
Yeah, I don't think that it has it built in. They're hoping for a firmware update that would do it, but the last discussion I saw on it didn't say anything about having it.
Okay, thanks.
As I said earlier,
Huh?
pardon.
I was asking Rhonda if she knows if hers does focus stacking, shifting, or breathing.
I don't know.
What do you
Okay,
have?
so
The Sony 7R,
I've got the A1.
the Sony A1?
Yeah.
So he'll look at it while we're talking.
I'm quite positive it'll have it built in. I mean, it's the competitor to the Z9. It's almost bound to have it. I'll take a quick look, but
Okay.
as I mentioned earlier, if your camera doesn't have it, don't stress. The guy I mentioned earlier who is being paid to fly around the country and teach classes doesn't use any of this. He just says, I don't even know. I just start at the one end and turn it until I hit the other end. So
That's kind of how I work.
It's all good. All right, so now we've opened in layers, we've auto aligned it. And then the next step is that we're going to start blending them. And you start in the same place. You go up to the edit menu, and right under auto align layers is auto blend layers. So you've got all your images again selected. You go to auto blend layers. And then in that process, it's going to ask you for panorama, which would be very nice if that's what you're trying to achieve. But in this case, you're talking about stack images. And seamless tones and colors are checked. Content aware field transparent area is checked in this case. And then what it does is it starts blending it. Now, this is the process that took the longest when I redid it yesterday. This process was probably 10, 12 minutes. So from the time I said open up as layers in Photoshop to the time it finished blending, it was about 22 minutes or so for 51 images. What's happening during this process that you see the difference is when you first open up as layers, you just have layers. But in the auto blending process, it actually creates a layer mask for all 51 images. So if you look over here by this 3, then you see that all of these images are starting to create a layer mask, and in them you can see some different areas that are focused. And I'm going to let David in a moment tell you a little bit about how this could be beneficial to you. But from my perspective, what I've seen both in like astrophotography when I've blended some image as well as this, is that there may be something on 1 or 2 of these images that need to be fixed. Like in the astrophotography, it was a meteor that was cut, star trail. In this case, for the succulent, there was just this one little edge where it needed attention. So I was able to sort out which image of the 51 that was appropriate. But honestly, it's easier just to get to the end and then do some editing in most cases. But if you want to go more in depth, that's what the layer mask can help you do in a moment. Then the final step of this process, if you look up at the top, it has now created a single merged image. It has a merged image from all 51. And barring that instance where you need to go into one of those images and do something, at this point, you can flatten the image and edit it as you want in Photoshop. So I'm going to stop there. David, anything you would add or talk more in depth about?
No, I think it's important to mention, how long did you say it took for this thing to do this?
About 22 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's on a fast processor.
Right. So, you're probably only going to do this if you're just really gotten into macro photography, to the extent that you're doing 51 images because of the time. Because we think about it took 8 minutes to get them uploaded as layers. It get 8 minutes to get them aligned. It took 22 minutes. Add that up. It's an hour just to get the image to where you can start editing it. Now, it creates very unique looking images. And that's why some people think about, I know I watched a YouTube video one time of a guy with an insect, a face on an insect or something, 380 some odd images. And he set it to stack and blend. And it took like 12 and a half hours or something. So, you're going to have to really be into this. But the thing is that if you can figure out how to do this with 51 images, you can figure out how to do it with 5 or 6 or 8, right? And you can get a really incredible image, macro image, without everything being in focus, and instead just getting the most intriguing elements of whatever it is you're photographing very sharp. and then the rest maybe doesn't have to worry about it. So it's really just understanding how the process works and then apply it as you need it. That would be the main thing that I would say here. And originally I was going to talk about another software to do this, but it's not any faster. It actually introduces a new wrinkle because you have to go to an outside software. You got to go pay for an outside software. And Photoshop has gotten a lot better at it. And, you know, I think if you go do something, and I would encourage you to just take something, anything, and do 4 images and then blend them and see what the masks look like. And then go in and change the mask and see what the result is. All of this will then go click, click, click. Oh, I understand what I'm doing.
And so David, or both of you, so it's kind of we still have artistic license, like you say. We could decide we wanted the whole thing to be sharp and do 51 images, or like you say, we can do 5 because we decided we just want something in the middle. So again, it's artistic interpretation.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. The reason you would do this is because, you know, with 51, now what were the results? Didn't you won recognition at your club?
Yeah.
Because
But I learned a lot. That was my deal. I learned a whole lot.
right. You learn a lot by doing it. 1, 2, you do create unique looking images that a lot of people aren't going to do. I mean, all of us are kind of shaking our head, wow, over an hour just to get to the point to where now I've got something I can edit, you know, in terms of lighting and color and texture or anything else. Not many people go to that effort. The guy that spoke at the club last night, he talked about his #1 selling image that he's done. He spent almost 18 hours editing that image. No one's going to do that. On the other hand, he's made tens of thousands of dollars from doing that, right? So it's like almost anything. If you put enough time and energy and effort into it, you create something that's more valuable than something that you put 5 minutes into. So I think the key part is understanding that the value of stacking to you get to decide when you use it. You have the creative license to determine, I just want the tips of that bug's antenna in focus. The rest of it, I don't care about, but I want those 2 antennae with the little bulbs on the end. I want those in focus. Might be one of the most amazing images anyone's ever seen. You have the license to do as many images or as few as you want, but it's important that you understand how it's doing it, why it's doing it, and how to manipulate things. So, okay.
And just a clarification, it was 25 minutes to get to the edited image, not an hour.
Yeah.
So that,
Well,
so it's
20
still 25 minutes.
was it 25 minutes from the time you started from Lightroom importing them into Photoshop?
Once I said open as layers in Photoshop and went through all this process, it was 25 minutes.
Okay.
But it was a fast processor. So
All right. Well, it's a fast processor, and maybe I had more images. I don't know. I just remember one taking me almost an hour to get it to the point where I could edit it.
yeah. It's it takes a while. So it's all fun though. Let's again, I would say, like in your landscape, if you do one with 3 to 5 steps in it, that's a good place to start. Is just go out, play with that, test a foreground, middle ground, background, as much of the foreground as you need. You'll learn a lot just from that process. All right. So anyway, this was kind of the end image, and I did some editing on some spots, some little bit of dirt and things like that on it. So that's just kind of how it all came together. It's not a perfect image by any means, but the real value was learning how to do this and why to do that. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation, so that you could learn something new if you choose to, and you would know why you would choose it and when you would choose it.
And so I'm sorry, Delana.
No,
But
you go right ahead.
the same process that would be like what we just took in Oregon, right? When we focus stacks, I do the same steps.
Yes,
That's correct.
that is absolutely correct. Yeah, we've done quite a bit of it.
Okay, thank you.
this is the other software that he was talking about. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but if you want to do any research, it's here in the presentation. We're going to post the presentation. We're going to post the Zoom video, etc. So you can go look at that. As David said, though, it is preferred by some, but not everyone. And Photoshop has really, really come a long way in being able to do this type of stacking for us.
If you really get into focus stacking, and in particular, if you start creating images that you think people are willing to pay to get, and macro images blown up to 60 inches by 40 inches are incredible. They're just incredible. But if you're going to do that, then that stacking, the effort you put into it is even more critical. And I think that the results from Helicon Focus are slightly better than you'll get in Photoshop. So I would only put that out there is that if somebody decides, hey, I want to do this, I really want to get really good at this, and in particular, I want to be able to create big images, then reach out to me one-on-one and we can kind of dig into Helicon Focus a little bit, how it operates. It's a different plugin and whatnot, but it's going to give you slightly better results, but probably marginal enough that it won't matter for 99% of the people. It's only if you're really going to want to do something pretty amazing and large and very detailed. Okay.
So just pause. Other thoughts, other questions regarding anything that you would do or want to know more about, or resources. There's a ton of YouTube videos on focus stacking by itself, on doing it with particular cameras, on doing it in different subjects, etc.
There's a rail that I saw advertised and is for focus stacking. Is that necessary? What's the point of that? I mean, it's almost like a little extended leg or tripod sort of thing.
So it's what it does is, rather than, remember I talked about focus breathing a little bit. So what the rail does is actually move your camera. And so you set your focus and it doesn't change, but you actually move your camera. Those rails are used, again, primarily when you're going to take 100 images or something like that. And they make those rails that are auto. In other words, they will actually, the whole camera will move by 100 millimeters or 1 millimeter or something at a time. I've always been intrigued by it. I'm a big gear guy and everything. I've decided I'm not that into macro. I'm not trying to do anything particularly creative with it. So fun stuff to play around with, but you can probably accomplish a whole lot just by being on a tripod and then using focus stacking within your camera.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Big question.
I'm thinking about buying a macro lens, and it's a macro 2X. The macro that I have, no, I'm not technical. The macro I have is I probably bought in 2009, and it's wonderful. But I mean, you get right up to your subject. You know, you're practically touching your flower with your nose. And I don't know how this one works. I guess it's like a 2X extension sort of thing. I think you can get a lot further away and still do macro, but I still don't understand.
Well, you can get a multiplier, a teleconverter. They also make something called extension tubes.
Yeah, I know about those. I just didn't know on that particular lens. It's a macro 2X. And
I've never seen or heard about that, so I can't really speak to it.
okay.
I've been intrigued with the idea of getting some of those extension tubes. If you've not heard about them before, they essentially allow you to mount your lens in reverse on your camera. And it allows you to get really close, and it functions as a macro lens, basically. And because you've got all these different focal lengths, these tubes allow you to experiment with different, I don't know, let's just say focusing capabilities with these extension tubes.
Mhm.
And a lot of times people that do very high-end macro stuff will work with these extension tubes that reverse the lens. And it's kind of a unique deal. Obviously, all manual focus because you're not connecting the drive motors and stuff to the camera. So
Right.
it
Okay.
changes the approach. There would be no way to use anything built into the camera as a focus stacking if you're using extension tubes. So again, they're another kind of cool piece of gear that you could play around with if you're just wanting to experiment. You know?
Yeah, I've looked at them a long time ago, but okay, thank you.
Yeah.